Hello, lovely listening squirrels. Let's get on to chapter 9 of The Body in the Library. Mrs. Bantry was with Adelaide Jefferson. The former came up to Sir Henry and exclaimed, "You?" "I myself." He took both her hands and pressed them warmly. "I can't tell you how distressed I am at all this, Mrs. B." Mrs. Bantry said mechanically, "Don't call me Mrs. B," and went on, "Arthur isn't here. He's taking it all rather seriously. Miss Marple and I have come here to Sleuth. Do you know Mrs. Jefferson?" "Yes, of course." He shook hands. Adelaide Jefferson said, "Have you seen my father-in-law?" "Yes, I have." Excuse me. "I'm glad. We're anxious about him. It was a terrible shock." Miss Bantry said, "Let's come out on the terrace and have drinks and talk about it all." The four of them went out and joined Mark Gaskell, who was sitting at the extreme end of the terrace by himself. After a few desultory remarks and the arrival of the drinks, Mrs. Bantry plunged straight into the subject with her usual zest for direct action. "We can talk about it, can't we?" she said. "I mean, we're all old friends except Miss Marple, and she knows all about crime, and she wants to help." Mark Gaskell looked at Miss Marple in a somewhat puzzled fashion. He said doubtfully, "Do you, write detective stories?" The most unlikely people he knew wrote detective stories, and Miss Marple, in her old-fashioned spinster clothes, looked a singularly unlikely person. "Oh, no, I'm not clever enough for that." "She's wonderful," said Mrs. Bantry impatiently. "I can't explain it now, but she is. Now, Addie, I want to know all about things. What was she really like, this girl?" "Well," Adelaide Jefferson paused, glanced across at Mark and half laughed. She said, "You're so direct." "Did you like her?" "No, of course I didn't." "What was she really like?" Mrs. Bantry shifted her inquiry to Mark Gaskell. Mark said deliberately, "Common, or garden gold digger, and she knew her stuff. She'd got her hooks into Jeff all right." Both of them called their father-in-law Jeff. Sir Henry thought, looking disapprovingly at Mark, indiscreet fellows shouldn't be so outspoken. He had always disapproved a little of Mark Gaskell. The man had charm, but he was unreliable, talked too much, was occasionally boastful, not quite to be trusted, Sir Henry thought. He had sometimes wondered if Conway Jefferson thought so too. "But couldn't you do something about it?" demanded Mrs. Bantry. Mark said dryly, "We might have, if we'd realized it in time." He shot a glance at Adelaide, and she colored faintly. There had been reproach in that glance. She said, "Mark thinks I ought to have seen what was coming." "You left the old boy alone too much, Addie. Tennis lessons and all the rest of it." "Well, I had to have some exercise." She spoke apologetically. "Anyway, I never dreamed." "No," said Mark, "neither of us ever dreamed. Jeff has always been such a sensible, level-headed old boy." Miss Marple made a contribution to the conversation. "Gentlemen," she said, with her old maid's way of referring to the opposite sex as though it were a species of wild animal, "are frequently not as level-headed as they seem." "I'll say you're right," said Mark. "Unfortunately, Miss Marple, we didn't realize that. We wondered what the old boy saw in that rather insipid and meretricious, I'm not sure, little bag of tricks, but we were pleased for him to be kept happy and amused. We thought there was no harm in her. I wish I'd wrung her neck." "Mark," said Addie, "you really must be careful what you say." He grinned at her engagingly. "I suppose I must, otherwise people will think I actually did wring her neck. Oh well. I suppose I'm under suspicion anyway. If anyone had an interest in seeing that girl dead, it was Addie and myself." "Mark," cried Mrs. Jefferson, half laughing and half angry, "you really mustn't." All right," said Mark Gaskell pacifically. "But I do like speaking my mind. £50,000 our esteemed father-in-law was proposing to settle upon that half-baked, nit-witted little sly puss." "Mark, you mustn't. She's dead." "Yes, she's dead, poor little devil, and after all, why shouldn't she use the weapons that nature gave her? Who am I to judge? Done plenty of rotten things myself in life. No, let's say Ruby was entitled to plot and scheme, and we were mugs not to have tumbled to her game sooner." Sir Henry said, "What did you say when Conway told you he proposed to adopt the girl?" Mark thrust out his hands. What could we say? Addie always the little lady, retained her self-control admirably, put a brave face upon it. I endeavored to follow her example. "I should have made a fuss," said Mrs. Bantry. "Well, frankly speaking, we weren't entitled to make a fuss. It was Jeff's money. We weren't his flesh and blood. He'd always been damned good to us. There was nothing for it but to bite on the bullet," he added reflectively. "But we didn't love little Ruby," Adelaide Jefferson said. "If only it had been some other kind of girl. Jeff had 2 godchildren, you know. If it had been one of them, well, one would have understood it," she added with a shade of resentment. "And Jeff's always seemed so fond of Peter." "Of course," said Mrs. Bantry. "I always have known Peter was your first husband's child, but I'd quite forgotten it. I've always thought of him as Mr. Jefferson's grandson." "So have I," said Adelaide. Her voice held a note that made Miss Marple turn in her chair and look at her. "It was Josie's fault," said Mark. "Josie brought her here." Adelaide said, "Oh, but surely you don't think it was deliberate, do you? Why, you always liked Josie so much." "Yes, I did like her. I thought she was a good sport. It was sheer accident, her bringing the girl down. Josie's got a good head on her shoulders, my girl." "Yes, but she couldn't foresee," Mark said. "No, she couldn't, I admit it. I'm not really accusing her of planning the whole thing. But I've no doubt she saw which way the wind was blowing long before we did and kept very quiet about it." Adelaide said with a sigh, "I suppose one can't blame her for that." Mark said, "Oh, we can't blame anyone for anything." Mrs. Bantry asked, "Was Ruby Keane very pretty?" Mark stared at her. "I thought you'd seen." Mrs. Bantry said hastily, "Oh, yes, I saw her body, but she'd been strangled, you know, and one couldn't tell." She shivered. Mark said thoughtfully, "I don't think she was really pretty at all. She certainly wouldn't have been without any makeup. A thin, ferrety little face, not much chin, teeth running down her throat. Nondescript sort of nose." "It sounds revolting," said Mrs. Bantry. "Oh, no, she wasn't. As I say, with makeup, she managed to give quite an effect of good looks. Don't you think so, Addie?" "Yes, rather chocolate box, pink and white business. She had nice blue eyes." "Yes, innocent baby stare, and the heavily black lashes brought out the blueness. Her hair was bleached, of course. It's true, when I come to think of it, that in coloring, artificial coloring anyway, she had a kind of spurious resemblance to Rosamond, my wife. You know, I dare say that's what attracted the old man's attention to her." He sighed. "Well, it's a bad business. The awful thing is that Addie and I can't help being glad, really, that she's dead." He quelled a protest from his sister-in-law. "It's no good, Addie. I know what you feel. I feel the same. And I'm not going to pretend, but at the same time, if you know what I mean, I really am most awfully concerned for Jeff about the whole business. It's hit him very hard. He stopped and stared towards the doors leading out of the lounge onto the terrace. "Well, well, see who's here. What an unscrupulous woman you are, Addie." Mrs. Jefferson looked over her shoulder, uttered an exclamation, and got up, a slight color rising in her face. She walked quickly along the terrace and went up to a tall, middle-aged man with a thin brown face who was looking uncertainly about him. Mrs. Bantry said, "Isn't that Hugo McLean?" Mark Gaskell said, "Hugo McLean it is, alias William Dobbin." Mrs. Bantry murmured, "He's very faithful, isn't he?" Dog-like devotion," said Mark. "Addie's only got to whistle, and Hugo comes trotting from any odd corner of the globe. Always hopes that some day she'll marry him. I dare say she will." Miss Marple looked beamingly after them. She said, "I see, a romance?" "One of the good old-fashioned kind," Mark assured her. "It's been going on for years. Addie's that kind of woman." He added meditatively, "I suppose Addie telephoned him this morning. She didn't tell me she had." Edwards came discreetly along the terrace and paused at Mark's elbow. "Excuse me, sir, Mr. Jefferson, I'd like you to come up." "I'll come at once." Mark sprang up. He nodded to them and said, "See you later," and went off. Sir Henry leant forward to Miss Marple. He said, "Well, what do you think of the principal beneficiaries of the crime?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully, looking at Adelaide Jefferson as she stood talking to her old friend, "I should think, you know, that she was a very devoted mother." "Oh, she is," said Mrs. Bantry. "She's simply devoted to Peter. She's the kind of woman..." Excuse me. Drip, drip, drip. Post-nasal drip is a pain. And that stuff you take for it is gross, gross, gross. I keep forgetting what you call Flonase. Ugh. Simply devoted. She's that kind of woman. I know what you mean. Said Sir Henry. Wait a minute. "She's the kind of woman," said Miss Marple, "that everyone likes. The kind of woman that could go on getting married again and again. I don't mean a man's woman. That's quite different." "I know what you mean," said Sir Henry. "What you both mean," said Mrs. Bantry, "is that she's a good listener." Sir Henry laughed. He said, "And Mark Gaskell?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "he's a downy fellow." "Village parallel, please?" "Mr. Cargill, the builder, he bluffed a lot of people into having things done to their houses they never meant to do, and how he charged them for it. But he could always explain his bills away plausibly. A downy fellow. He married money. So did Mr. Gaskell, I understand." "You don't like him?" "Yes, I do. Most women would, but he can't take me in. He's a very attractive person, I think, but a little unwise, perhaps, to talk as much as he does." "Unwise is the word," said Sir Henry. "Mark will get himself into trouble if he doesn't look out." A tall, dark young man in white flannels came up the steps to the terrace and paused just for a minute, watching Adelaide Jefferson and Hugo McLean. "And that," said Mr. Henry obligingly, "is X." Like the letter. "Whom we might describe as an interested party. He's the tennis and dancing pro, Raymond Starr, Ruby Keane's partner." Miss Marple looked at him with interest. She said, "He's very nice looking, isn't he?" "I suppose so. Don't be absurd, Sir Henry," said Mrs. Bantry. "There's no supposing about it. He is good looking." Miss Marple murmured, "Mrs. Jefferson's been taking tennis lessons, I think," she said. "Do you mean anything by that, Jane, or don't you?" Mrs. Marple had no chance of replying to this downright question. Young Peter Carmody came across the terrace and joined them. He addressed himself to Sir Henry. "I say, are you a detective too? I saw you talking to the superintendent. The fat one is the superintendent, isn't he?" Quite right, my son. And somebody told me you were a frightfully important detective from London, the head of Scotland Yard or something like that. The head of Scotland Yard is usually a complete dud in books, isn't he? Oh no, not nowadays. Making fun of the police is very old-fashioned. Do you know who did the murder yet? Not yet, I'm afraid. Are you enjoying this very much, Peter? Asked Mrs. Bantry. Well, I am rather. It makes a change, doesn't it? I've been hunting round to see if I could find any clues, but I haven't been lucky. I have a souvenir, though. Would you like to see it? Fancy, Mother wanted me to throw it away. I do think one's parents are rather trying sometimes. He produced from his pocket a small matchbox. Pushing it open, he disclosed the previous contents. See, it's a fingernail, her fingernail. I'm going to label it Fingernail of the Murdered Woman and take it back to school. It's a good souvenir, don't you think? Where did you get it? Asked Miss Marple. Well, it was a bit of luck, really, because of course I didn't know she was going to be murdered then. It was before dinner last night. Ruby caught her nail in Josie's shawl and tore it. Mums cut it off for her and gave it to me and said put it in the wastepaper basket. And I meant to, but I put it in my pocket instead, and this morning I remembered and looked to see if it was still there, and it was. So now I've got it as a souvenir. Disgusting, said Mrs. Bantry. Peter said politely, oh, do you think so? Got any other souvenirs? Asked Sir Henry. Well, I don't know. I've got something that might be. Explain yourself, young man. Peter looked at him thoughtfully. Then he pulled out an envelope. From the inside of it, he extracted a piece of browny, tapey substance. It's a bit of that chap George Bartlett's shoelace, he explained. I saw his shoes outside the door this morning, and I bagged a bit just in case. In case what? In case he should be the murderer, of course. He was the last person to see her, and that's always frightfully suspicious, you know. Is it nearly dinner time, do you think? I'm frightfully hungry. It always seems like a long time between tea and dinner. Hello, there's Uncle Hugo. I didn't know Mum had asked him to come down. I suppose she sent for him. She always does it if she's in a jam. Here's Josie coming. Hi, Josie. Josephine Turner, coming along the terrace, stopped and looked rather startled to see Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple. Miss Bantry said pleasantly, how do you do, Miss Turner? We've come to do a bit of sleuthing. Josie cast a guilty glance round. She said, lowering her voice, it's awful. Nobody knows yet. I mean, it isn't in the papers yet. I suppose everyone will be asking me questions, and it's so awkward. I don't know what I ought to say. Her glance went rather wistfully towards Miss Marple, who said, yes, it will be a very difficult situation for you, I'm afraid. Josie warmed to this sympathy. You see, Mr. Prescott said to me, don't talk about it, and that's all very well, but everyone is sure to ask me, and you can't offend people, can you? Mr. Prescott said he hoped I'd feel better. I'd feel able to carry on as usual. And he wasn't very nice about it, so of course I want to do my best, and I really don't see why it should all be blamed on me. Sir Henry said, do you mind me asking you a frank question, Miss Turner? Oh, do ask me anything you like, said Josie a little insincerely. Has there been any unpleasantness between you and Mrs. Jefferson and Mr. Gaskell over all this? Over the murder, do you mean? No, I don't mean the murder. Josie stood twisting her fingers together. She said rather sullenly, well, there has and there hasn't. If you know what I mean, neither of them has said anything, but I think they blamed it on me. Mr. Jefferson taking such a fancy to Ruby. I mean, It wasn't my fault, though, was it? These things happen, and I never dreamt of such a thing happening beforehand, not for a moment. I was quite dumbfounded. Her words rang out with what seemed undeniable sincerity. Sir Henry said kindly, "I'm quite sure you were. But once it had happened?" Josie's chin went up. "Well, it was a piece of luck, wasn't it? Everyone's got the right to have a piece of luck sometimes." She looked from one to the other of them in a slightly defiant, questioning manner, and then went on across the terrace into the hotel. Peter said judicially, "I don't think she did it." Miss Marple murmured, "It's interesting, that piece of fingernail. It had been worrying me, you know, how to account for her nails." "Nails?" asked Sir Henry. "The dead girl's nails," explained Mrs. Bantry. "They were quite short, and now that Jane says so, of course it was a little unlikely. A girl like that usually has absolute talons." Miss Marple agreed. "But of course, if she tore one off, then she might have clipped the others close so as to match. Did they find nail parings in her room, I wonder?" Sir Henry looked at her curiously. He said, "I'll ask Superintendent Harper when he gets back." "Back from where?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "He hasn't gone over the Gossington, has he?" Sir Henry said gravely, "No, there's been another tragedy. Blazing car in a quarry." Miss Marple caught her breath. "Was there someone in the car?" "I'm afraid so, yes." Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I expect that will be the girl's guide who's missing. Pamela Reeves." Sir Henry stared at her. "Now, why on earth do you think that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple got rather pink. "Well, it was given out on the wireless that she was missing from her home since last night, and her home was Daneley's Vale. That's not very far from here, and she was last seen at the Girl Guide rally up on Danebury Downs." "That's very close indeed. In fact, she'd have to pass through Dannemouth to get home, so it does rather fit in, doesn't it? I mean, it looks as though she might have seen, or perhaps heard, something that no one was supposed to see and hear. If so, of course, she'd be a source of danger to the murderer. And she'd have to be removed. Two things like that must be connected, don't you think?" Sir Henry said, his voice dropping a little. "You think a second murder? Why not?" Her quiet, placid gaze met his. "When anyone has committed one murder, they don't shrink from another, do they? Nor even from a third." "A third? You don't think there will be a third murder?" "I think it's just possible. Yes, I think it's highly possible." "Miss Marple," said Sir Henry, "you frighten me. Do you know who is going to be murdered?" Miss Marple said, "I've a very good idea." And that's the end of the chapter. So hopefully we'll get to 10 tomorrow. What you think? Any ideas? I always get an idea and then the next chapter is a different idea. Let's see, I might need to charge that up again. Well, I'll let y'all go. Don't forget the Crotchety Clogger at 8:30 Eastern tonight. I think it's gonna be live with her and Madonna, and it ought to be a lot of laughs. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye. Be sweet, don't be ugly.